Welcome to Raising the Bar with Dr. O. We are so excited to have one of our first guests on our new podcast, Raising the Bar, Senator Tizzy Lockman.
Hey.
Thank you so much for coming.
I'm absolutely honored.
And we are going to literally jump right in.
Okay.
So before we jump into just the education landscape and everything that's happening in the city of Wilmington, which is a lot.
A lot.
I actually want to start with you and hear more about your journey to government and what made you want to become a politician?
Okay, so the why question.
Yes.
It was a surprise to me on some level that I ended up taking this path. It was not in my plans necessarily, but I like to say that I came by it honestly because I grew up in a household where, there was a lot of civic engagement happening in terms of, like my mom was very involved with like League of Women Voters, that kind of thing. And my father was a political journalist. So Norman Lockman wrote for the News Journal for many, many years. He passed away in 2005. But so politics was just like a dinner table thing. It was not, not something that we ignored in our home. And my father would take us to events and things like that. So was familiar. And I gravitated more to the communications side of things, behind the scenes communications side of things. And that's what I pursued in college and the beginning of my career. But I think that civic muscle was always there, and that interest in the policy side of things, just based on seeing my parents model that. So then I think what ended up happening is when I became a mother in 2003, when my daughter was born, I really began to step up to that. It really changes your perspective, and you think, what world am I creating for my child or my children to live in? And so, the snowball just starts rolling downhill, right? And I had several experiences that I think led me here. I was a public ally through AmeriCorps, doing some nonprofit work, and that really instilled in me, I think, a strong philosophy around local leadership, and ended up running the PTA at my daughter's school and serving on some boards, including the the ACLU. And and eventually it brought me to a point of where I was seeing things, particularly in the education landscape, that I found very compelling. I mean, I think that's what happens. My daughter enrolled in kindergarten not 10 years after I graduated from the same school system, Red Clay School District. And I was surprised by some of the things that I was seeing in Wilmington in the schools, how much more segregated they were than when I was attending schools in the 80s, for example. And so just wanted to understand more what had happened in those intervening 10 years. I graduated in 1997, and my daughter enrolled in kindergarten in 2008. And so I ended up leaving my work. I was working in television production at the time, and went back to grad school at UD to study education policy. And then came out of that, became an organizer, worked at the Christina Cultural Arts Center, trying to help other parents like myself understand school systems and do what we could to step up as PTA presidents and advocates. That continued to snowball until where in 2017, my friends convinced me to run for office. I'll just put it that way. And I went for it and was able to win my seat representing the 3rd Senatorial District in Wilmington. And again, what compelled me to finally answer that call that I had never really taken seriously or heard from within me before was looking at the district map of the 3rd District. And it has the largest portion of the city of Wilmington. There's 3 of us senators who have parts of Wilmington, but I have the largest portion. And it's downtown and the riverfront and everything you would consider the west side, most of what you would consider the east side. And I knew, just looking at that map from my experiences, that it contained some of the schools we worry about the most, and the schools that are consistently number one and top 100, 200 in the nation rankings, right? So I'm like, wow, what a contrast, what a problem to solve. So, a lot of the showier parts of politics aren't necessarily my thing necessarily, but I knew that I could step up if it meant that I could grapple with that. So education policy has always been what drove my activity, I think, in the civic space and what brought me to politics. And I definitely left out a few steps there, but I think, I was involved in the Wilmington Education Improvement Commission, which Tony Allen led. In the mid 2010s. And that experience was probably the first time I went to Dover and kind of saw how that conversation was happening there, and the state levels where a lot of big education policy decisions are made. And I was concerned about what that looked like. And I thought, well, I can sign up for this. I can do that. I can be that listening ear that maybe has a better understanding of what Wilmington parents are facing and what we want for our kids. So that was a big part of it as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It makes sense, right? And I kind of resonated with the idea of coming from a family of service. My father was a Baptist pastor, so I figured I'm always going to have to do something helping and giving back. So that really resonated with me. So politics,
yes,
right? People have sometimes a negative perception of what politicians do and who they are. What are some challenges that you've encountered just being in this political space and dealing with that kind of negative perception that folks have?
I mean, look, I'm not that far removed from that perception, right? Like, I was just a citizen and an advocate, and I saw politicians and I was like, I'm like, they're just taking selfies all the time. Like, what are they even doing? Like, I definitely can identify a little bit with that mindset, because the process of policymaking can feel so slow, and in the meantime, we see a lot of pomp and circumstance around politicians, and that mismatch can be really frustrating as a citizen. And so, actually getting into it is very transformative. You kind of realize some of why things can drag. I mean, it's that spirit of democratic policymaking where there's 62 of us as legislators who are coming from all corners of the state of Delaware and going to Dover on a regular basis to have conversations about how we do things. We all think quite differently, even within parties, about the right way to go, even if we might sort of like on a values base agree what we want all kids to be educated, or we want everyone to be able to feed their families. But how to get there is where we tend to really disagree. And so what happens in the part of politics that I think people tend to watch less is where we're really grappling with that and trying to figure out the best path to take to achieve those things. So I enjoy that part. I enjoy getting to know people from all walks of life, as frustrating as it can be when we can't get on the same page. And then therefore, as an elected official, it makes me feel like I can't deliver as quickly for the people that I represent. But I mean, ultimately, politics, I think, as we think of it, is just like that public-facing side of a conversation that we are all having to figure out how best to serve people. And I think most of the people that I work with, all of the people that I work with, came there to do good things for their neighbors, and we often call Delaware like the state of neighbors. So I think it's ultimately about that democracy piece more than anything. But of course, I think social media has really changed things a lot too.
No,
in terms of
not social media.
You just see the most extreme parts of that discourse, and it also does. I mean, it has an impact on the way we have that dialogue in Dover sometimes, because it's hard not to still be mad at your friend who said something out of pocket on Facebook, and then you want to come and just sort of pal around. So it's complicated for sure, and it's become a lot more complicated. Yes. But to me, politics is just kind of like, a necessary part of the equation of moving the needle on policymaking and changing the structures and systems that serve us all. I mean, we live together in a society that is governed by several levels of government, and trying to make that work more smoothly and more in service of everyone who lives here, is what it's all about.
I love that, the public-facing part of the conversation. How do you move from point A, because you kind of talked about it, right? The process can feel like it takes forever.
It does.
So how does that happen? How do you move from, okay, I have this great idea that I think will help this thing, and I need it to go through this process? How does that work?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I'll let you know when I figure it out. But so I've been doing this for 6 years, no, almost 8. Wow. Okay. Almost 8 years next year. So, it depends. It depends on the issue. Some issues are harder to navigate than others. But I think what I have found probably is that you might come to an issue thinking you already know what the answer is. And let's be honest, all of us do that. You see a problem and you know, for whatever reason, someone you trust told you, or you had a personal experience, you think you know the answer to that. In order to actually get to the point where you have a policy that you can pass, sometimes means having to take a step back and have some humility and realize that there might be other ways to achieve the goal of solving that problem. And so a lot of our processes look like that. It's how do you, perhaps you just put your solution on the table as a starting point, or maybe the starting point is like, let me gather together a bunch of people I know are going to have different takes on this and start a conversation and hash out a solution. But it really is a lot of having to accept the idea that your chosen solution may not be the only option to be considered, or there might be variations on it that are going to actually accommodate the widest set of viewpoints and desires for good outcomes. So yeah, I mean, it's that. And sometimes that process can take a month, and sometimes that process can take 10, 20, 30 years. And so, I feel like a lot of the things that are top on my list, my priority list as a policy maker, are things that I've been sitting around tables talking about for, 10, 15 years. And I was like maybe coming midstream, late stream to those conversations because other people have been having them for decades. Of course, I'm talking about education policy, particularly education policy in Wilmington. And, that can be very frustrating for everybody involved, especially for people who just want to send their child to a high quality school and feel like they will be safe and well educated at the end of the day and the end of the school year.
Absolutely. And that kind of shifts us right to the city of Wilmington and the plethora of challenges that we're facing in the city. We know that our student outcomes are nowhere near where we want them to be. When you're looking at testing scores or attendance or chronic absenteeism, they're just not where we want them to be. So when you look, and you've been working within the city of Wilmington for a number of years from different areas, and I know it's hard to kind of pinpoint, but when you look at it, what would you say is one of the biggest ismes that the city of Wilmington's educational landscape? I mean,
well, you know what I'm going to say, probably. I mean, there's so many. I mean, but again, I think this comes from years of, admiring really abhorring the problem, right? But looking at that and thinking about it, I think the biggest issue to me right now that I think that I could fix, particularly as a state policymaker, is a governance issue, which is really a hard thing to have a conversation about with constituents, because it can feel a little bit like, it can just feel a little vague or a little removed from what we the average citizen, the normal mom, I'm also one of those, experiences on a day-to-day, where it's sort of like, what's going on in the classroom, what's going on in the hallways, and safety. That's probably what comes top of mind to everyone. But I think what I see is this fractured governance that we have been subject to for a really long time, and has kind of had this trickle-down impact of allowing these things that any of us could pull, any of the many examples of what we're concerned about in terms of what our child is experiencing in one of our public school buildings, things that concern us, I think can be taken up a few levels. And that was my experience as like a PTA mom, was starting to understand, like, well, why I was worried that like we didn't have any full-time specials in our classroom or in our school building. And so you find out that like that isn't necessarily something that your principal wanted. It's because of the availability of units that are decisions that are being made on the district level. And then so you go and you advocate on the district level, and then you find out that that's actually the result of state level policy about how resources are allocated to each individual school district. So while there's those very real practical things that happen day to day, it's actually a result of these like state level policies or decisions about how our schools are actually governed. So for me, I've been able to boil it down to that and how fragmented we are by having four major school districts overseeing our city. But then you also have to see that there's also the Newcastle County VOTEC, so that's another layer of governance. Each charter school is in its own individual district, essentially, how that functions from a governance standpoint. So we've got a lot of like different kinds of decisions being made all the time that impact different kids in different classrooms, and it's become a chaotic mess, and it makes it a lot more difficult to offer solutions that reach all children, but especially those who tend not to benefit from our systems oftentimes. And yeah, so to me, the biggest problem facing us is that fragmentation of who is making decisions about how the service of education is being delivered.
And why did that happen? So what led to the whose idea was this?
Well, I mean, lots of the road to these things is often paved with good intentions, right? So, go back far enough, we had a City of Wilmington school district, and there were just many small school districts all across the county, which you still see in some other states. That's not uncommon, but because there were a lot of disparities in terms of wealth, and sometimes those became like racialized disparities. It immediately in like the decade after the civil rights movement really gained a lot of steam, and that's 2 decades after we decided that schools should be desegregated based on a Supreme Court decision, was the moment when that really happened for Delaware. And we decided that we needed to take more drastic action to segregate our schools, and that was like a redistricting decision that was made in the late 70s. And so what first happened by court order was that we actually had a countywide school district. And then I wasn't there. There's a lot of books you can read on this and people you can still talk to. J Street's usually my phone call for history lessons on some of this stuff. But then that was pretty quickly, I think within the first year in the early 80s after this rolled out, was broken into smaller districts. And the decision was made that because the goal was to desegregate Wilmington and to make sure resources were fairly shared across the county, was to cut Wilmington essentially into like 4 pie pieces that were shared by their most neighboring area of the suburbs. And so that would make sure that like there was a shared tax base between the suburbs and the city, because a lot of people were fleeing the city for the suburbs in those times. And that included having this like 2-piece district where the city of Newark ended up having a piece of Wilmington, and then that was paired with the Newark area school district out in the suburbs, because they were trying to avoid, white flight or flight from the city out into the suburbs, which, by the way, still happened. It just happened to create Appoquinimink, but we can talk about that later. Anyway, it was a decision made in the judiciary to come up with this remedy that local decision makers were struggling to get on the same page about. And that's frequently been the story with education in Delaware, where rather than be able to come up with a local solution on the ground with community members and elected officials, the court is called upon to step in and do their best with good intentions to create a desegregated and very fair system. But yeah, so that is actually how that happened. It happened through the courts. And then, we had busing to create a mixture of students in every school across those districts for a number of years, and ultimately kind of culminated in additional policies that were responsive to people's concerns with what happened during the forced busing era. And that was a very dramatic era all across the country where busing was happening.
Absolutely.
You were seeing people come out. There's some really disturbing photographs if you want to look into history of people protesting Black students being bused into schools that were formerly predominantly white. Really disturbing times.
Absolutely. My mother was actually bused for her senior year of high school.
Oh, man.
And to this day, I know the school's name, Hunter Huss, and this is in North Carolina,
there
Gastonia, and she still talks about how horrible that experience was for her, leaving her school as a high school junior and having to spend her senior year in a desegregated school. And it still to this day is a hurt space for her, or a space of pain for her. So I can only imagine, because we still have people in the community who experience that directly.
Caused a lot of trauma.
Absolutely. And when we think about that trauma and that kind of community hurt, how do you see that kind of impacts the conversations that we're having now? Because it comes out. We hear it in a lot of conversations. How do you think it impacts this what we're trying to do now, or maybe even discussions of the past?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely it does. I think people, like you said, it's like it's yesterday for someone who experienced maybe that really brutal racism in a very direct and overt way that they experienced. That's not something that goes away, and that's not something that anyone would wish upon their children, and so I think there's regret over how that played out, and so a lot of fear of doing something like that again. I think that there is a desire to not push, I guess, for certain types of progress that might put particularly children in that position again. And I'm very sympathetic to that. I think as a policymaker, I take very seriously the cautionary tale of that era. I think we really have to learn from the mistakes that were made that did put particularly vulnerable young people in those types of situations. And be both committed to our policy ideas of what's going to make things better, but never lose sight of the human desires and the human needs in that picture, to not put people in harm's way. So I mean, again, it's complicated to do that because you want to do big, bold things when you're doing policy, right? You've read a book, you've read a study about what the right way to do things is, and I'm very guilty of that. I'm like, this is what the evidence says. But on the path from where we are now to getting to that ideal, you have to be very sensitive that it's real people having real experiences that are going to define their whole lives, just like your mom has not forgotten what happened to her senior year of high school.
Absolutely. And so we have Redding, and I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit around Redding, because Redding is seeking to really engage in this effort and drive this effort.
Yes.
So tell us about Redding. How was it created? Where are we now?
Sure. So the Redding Consortium for Educational Equity is its full name. And it was kind of the rebirth of the organization that I mentioned before that Tony Allen led, the Wilmington Education Improvement Commission. And that commission was actually created through legislation, but it was a result of then Governor Jack Markell was trying to do some bold stuff in the city. There was some backlash from council members and others. I was actually a fellow, full disclosure, at city council at the time, so I might have kind of encouraged some of that backlash. But so we were trying to stand up for having our voice at the table, and so there was something called WEAC, a committee that was created, and that committee created the commission, and we went through this whole process of saying, what would really help would be if we consolidated school districts in this city, so let's talk about it. And so we went through that whole process. We ultimately were unsuccessful, one of the catalysts for me to run for office, but then Representative Nnamdi Chukwucha and I were both elected in 2018, and we sat down within our first week of being in our offices in Dover, and we're realized that we shared a goal, because we'd been sitting at tables talking about this for years at that point, which was to continue that work of WEAC, which had kind of hit a wall, and on some level remedy what we very well knew had been happening for the last, at that point, 15 to 20 years. And I can get into Neighborhood Schools Act, Schools Choice, all these other policies that came into play in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so we decided we were going to renew WEAC, rename it, give it kind of a new set of goals. And we did that with a piece of legislation, formed the Redding Consortium for Educational Equity, and put together about 25 individuals from the greater Wilmington community, obviously administrators, educators, to see if we could take what we hope is the final crack at, quote unquote, solving the Wilmington problem, which to us means helping clear away the barriers for Wilmington to be a great education system that it deserves to be, and figure out what is the best design for that. What would ideally it look like in terms of what the shape of school districts in and around Wilmington and Newcastle County, northern Newcastle County is what it says in the code, look like, and what are like other policies that have been problematic and in the way of achieving that goal. So that's what Redding's about, and we have been around now since 2019, so going on 6 years of studying how achievement is going in Wilmington, what are some of the barriers, and putting together a proposal. For the last 2 to 3 years, we've been very focused on redistricting. So making good on this promise that we are going to seriously try to unify governance in and around potentially the city of Wilmington so that it is easier to deliver on good policy and really good education for students and educators, the working environments, all that good stuff. So that's what we're about. We're about like trying to finally get serious about just setting things right again.
Getting it done.
Getting it done finally. We know what, well, do we know what to do? I don't know. There's a lot of opinions about what to do. But I think there's like, there are some things that we can agree on, and that's where we've tried, to your point about like, how do you actually get to an end goal, especially on something big and personal like education. So for us, it was, let's figure out what we can agree on and just take it step by step from there. So for example, we passed like we called it our interim plan for redistricting. And we were like, all right, people are get very activated, very anxious about this topic. So let's just focus on what we can agree on. And what we could get people to agree on was they were like, there should be 2 or fewer major governing units in the city of Wilmington. So like 2 or fewer school districts as opposed to the 4+ that we have now. And also that the Christina School District, and that's a whole nother podcast. You can talk to someone about the history of Christina in the city and in general. But that Christina should no longer be operating in the city as that like little discontiguous, disconnected footprint. Those were the 2 things people could agree on. And so we just voted on that, got that in writing, and started from there and said, okay, if we all agree on those 2 things, what are our options? And that's what we've been doing in the 18 months since.
And I'm finding as we get closer to this, it seems like anxiety is getting a little higher. And I had a chance to look at some of the history and the historical backdrop and the Delaware Solution for Schools that WEAC, the report that WEAC published, I think in 2015. And I was so curious what happened in 2015, right? Like all of this happened. There's about at that point 16 years kind of of focus groups and this redistricting recommendation, and then 2015 came and it got to all the way up, I believe, to the state board, and it was a 3-4 decision to not pass through.
Well, no, it did pass the state board.
Or pass the first one, and then was it the General Assembly?
So I think they sent us something back and we revisited it. So it did pass the state board. And then it passed the House. And then it died in the Senate at the time.
That's what happened.
By a couple of votes. Yeah, it got so close.
Oh, wow.
So close to totally passing. And what they decided instead, and I think it was legislators, if I'm not incorrect, it was legislators representing suburban areas who, had concerns about taking on the Christina footprint. Because at the time, what the recommendation was that the Christina schools and students would all go to Red Clay, all to one school district.
Oh, okay.
And so before agreeing to that, I think logically, suburban Red Clay legislators were like, you know what, we need a little more information. Let's look at like the physical schools and find out how much would it cost for us to get them into the condition that we think they would need to be in. Was honestly kind of
it came down to the buildings.
It kind of came down to the buildings.
Wow.
Yeah, and the answer to that question was obviously like a lot of money.
Of course.
And then in the ensuing years, actually, the state stepped up and made the investment. That's why we have Pritchett, the Pritchett School now, beautiful.
It is.
$100 million school building that took a lot of time. And then there's also been investments made at Bayard and, ongoing work at Pulaski to do that. And that's money that's come from the state. That Red Clay School District at the time, I think, very fairly was concerned about that ending up coming from like local funding and what the implications might be there. But that's been kind of fixed.
Yeah.
So that concern should
be
off the table. But then also in our process of having conversations, when we said 2 or fewer school districts and no Christina, we had like 9 things that could mean. And three of those things involved like giving that footprint of Christina School District to just one other district, Red Clay or Brandywine or Colonial, the non-Christina remaining school districts. And that was something that I think maybe as a result of that WEAG process was very clearly identified as like, that's going to be a problematic way to go. Yeah. So those options all came off the table very quickly.
Because we learned from the past.
And so that left us with, a smaller subset of 6, which, we're working with like a national partner doing research, American Institutes for Research. We're kind of digging deeper on the remaining 6 options. But we actually are focused, we've got it narrowed down kind of to 3 that we think are really viable that Redding Consortium is grappling with.
Tell us about the 3.
Okay.
What are the 3?
The other ones that were removed, I'll just clear those away. Of the 6 that we narrowed down when we got rid of the ones I just mentioned, were having Colonial stay in play because there's sort of some disconnect there. That was a little controversial. And probably also for some people listening, perhaps we eliminated Wilmington School District as an option. There's some misinformation out there about that.
So let's stay there.
Why
did we eliminate Wilmington School District as an option?
There were definitely sentiments on both sides. Some people who really saw that as like, let's go back to that golden era because it was, I think, for a lot of people, for a lot of ways. But then on the detractor side, it was really about like the tax base, what can we afford to actually do as a school district, and what other challenges might that bring, in what seemed pretty likely to be a movement that would like isolate a lot of lower income students in a concentrated way. And there's a lot of information out there about, the negative impact of concentrated poverty in a school. We still have a lot of that. But to like actually design a school district where you are almost ensuring that that's going to happen, and it's going to be really difficult to address in any way other than like hoping the state gives you lots and lots of money in a long-term way. And that was just a huge question mark.
Now, why did it work before and versus it working now?
There was a lot more socioeconomic diversity, and, both within the communities and within the student populations. So you just had more. You didn't have that suburban flight. Like I used the term white flight earlier, and that's what it was at one point. It's not just white flight anymore. People move out of the city when they have the means to do so and get a house with a nice lawn and things like that. And that has an impact when you have less wealth in a community, obviously. Like that's
so the actual just social economic structure has changed. What we had then, we just don't have now. It's completely different.
Right, and that's why you can have a school that has that level of concentrated poverty because it represents a community. It serves a community that has that concentration of poverty. And so you have to figure out ways of designing and supporting schools and school districts to acknowledge that. But you can also try to avoid like doubling down on those problems, if that makes sense.
So it would Wilmington School District, if we had it, would just be at a financial deficit.
Yes. But I will say, and I think what is still on the table, because this comes up not just for the city but for the suburbs as well, is like there are sort of cultural and community characters and connections that you want to preserve. And I think a big problem currently with the split districts is that Wilmington's voice was split all different ways, and the strength of that community as a cohesive unit was lost. And so I think we still need to think about, all right, with the options that are still on the table, how do we not have it so that Wilmington doesn't have a strong unified voice? How do we not, erode sense of community in some certain suburban clusters and things like that? And I think that's doable. Other places have grappled with that and figured out ways to do that that I think are really interesting. But I think that's, we have the Office of Educational Advocacy.
We're here, raising the bar.
Unity, yes, to the Voice of Wilmington. And, there's also the Wilmington Learning Collaborative doing that work on the ground with schools. So I think there are ways to make sure that Wilmington does not get lost in the shuffle again.
Absolutely, because we have these other structures now that are here to represent the voices for the city of Wilmington.
But I don't know that you need to be a standalone unit. I think the potential to be sort of politically and socially isolated there is a real scary risk that I have had strong feelings about myself. But so as a group, though, that was eliminated. And that was probably in large part because we do have this national partner, AIR, giving us data that really painted the picture that
what this would look like.
And that it would be really difficult to make it work.
Yeah.
So that came off the table.
Okay.
So the three options that are still on the table, one is kind of this historical model that used to be called the River Plan. So it's one way to divide the city into two, although we aren't necessarily using the city as a dividing line. But basically what we have is Red Clay and Brandywine, each taking, a fair portion. We haven't decided exactly how that would break down, of Christina and Colonial, who would also come out of the city, taking their students and buildings. The Colonial doesn't have any buildings in the city, and then just dividing the city so it's governed by two school districts. So that's one option, sort of the River Plan, two-district option. The other two that are still on the table both unify the city as one, but not standing alone. One we kind of call the Metropolitan District. I've heard that that's a weird way to put it, but what it does is it unifies the city. So Christina and Colonial no longer serve the city. Okay. And then combines the city geographically with Red Clay and Brandywine, which would then also consolidate. So you end up with one upper northern Newcastle County school district. Okay. One district. It used to be Red Clay and Brandywine and the city. Now it's one. We call it metropolitan model.
Okay, that's the metropolitan.
So that's one potential option. It gives you some unity for the city, but it also preserves, kind of what was attempted with DSEG in more of a tax-based probably argument there, but also just leaving a little more room to maneuver and create flexibility as a school district. And then the third one, which I never honestly would have thought would have ended up in our top three options, but it's really gained a lot of steam as we look at data and have conversations about this, is just a northern Newcastle County model. And what that literally just does is it takes not just the city unified, but all four school districts in northern Newcastle County, Red Clay, Brandywine, Colonial, and Christina, and turns them all into one large school district of about 40,000 students.
Wow. Now, why did you think that wouldn't be an option or on the table?
I mean, I guess the way I always thought about it as a student of this is that you have city on one end and county on the other, and they both just, I tend to see things in terms of you're going to end up somewhere compromised in the middle. I just thought that made political sense. But there's a lot of strong case to be made for the way a consolidated northern Newcastle County clears away the barriers of fragmentation that have been so difficult in providing both services in schools, but also the wraparound services that a lot of our students need. And that's certainly true in Wilmington. It's also true throughout the county.
Absolutely.
As well. But, as always, I think one of the reasons why, we're doing this work through Redding, it's about Wilmington. Wilmington is my priority. But I think what we see happening in Wilmington, the poor outcomes and strife and all these kinds of things, is a result of bad structures that we've had in place for a while, problematic structures. Those are a problem throughout the entire state.
Yes. It's
just that in combination with concentration of poverty and other issues in the city of Wilmington, you see it most extremely here. And so what I've taken away is that these are structures that really need to be addressed for everybody. With the benefit of let's start with Wilmington first, where we've put people through the most, and delivered the least on the promise of
quality education.
Quality education.
Yeah, I mean that sounds significant.
Yeah,
and
scary.
A little scary, right? A little scary. And I think it, when people are discussing it, that fear comes up often because one, it's big change, and there are a lot of questions around what does this look like? Yeah. What does this mean? You know, I've spoken to a few school leaders who are just like, what is happening? And, you know, so what are some misconceptions that are out there about redistricting, about the work that is happening?
I mean, I think one, we faced this during WEAC too, is that people just think there's already like a plan in place and that is going to be like rained down upon them. And that is not true. We've worked really hard for a long time to very openly deliberate over this. And we still are, even as we're in these like last 3 months of getting to a draft where we really want to know what people think and what people want out of their local school and the overall school system. How do you use the system? How would you rather be using the system? So I think the idea that like we are, you know, just going to come and yank them around is not the goal. This is really about building something in a positive sense. Yeah. So I think that's a big misconception. And I think this misconception that it's, you know, just always that negative spin that like Wilmington is a drag and who are we going to put that drag on is the thing that breaks my heart the most, because I think like we all see room for improvement in this system. There's lots of great people in this system, educators, administrators, students, even the ones who aren't achieving great. There's so much potential here. And I really, you know, I don't know if that's so much a misconception, but it's just people leaning into all those negative perceptions about our students, our educators, and rather than seeing how can we do something bold that unlocks that potential for everybody together. So yeah, I think we've gotten so used to like fighting for scraps. Yeah. And it's a hard mindset to get out of.
And I think that's a big piece, and you nailed it around mindset. And how do we move to this lens of what's possible and what can happen when these significant changes come through the pipeline and be a part of the conversation. Yes. And I think that's a big piece, because we are in this political space where it just feels like things are happening to us. And at every turn, like this is happening. These decisions we don't have a say in. We're actually, someone's breaking the law, right? Like all of these things are happening in this political space that people are scared that that's what's happening here. Yeah. So how do we combat that? How do we reach out and let people know that this is not what's happening with Redding and with redistricting? We are actually trying to do the opposite of that.
I think just by including people, and I know it's hard, there's so many things to get your attention right now, and there's so many things that do seem scary that I'm like, let's put our energy into this in a positive way. Let's get excited. So like we're having a community engagement event this Saturday at Warner School. That's September 27th for anyone who's listening at a different time, so maybe you missed it. But, you know, where we're going to be looking at the data, but trying to talk about it in a way that like anyone who just walked in the door for the first time can get that and be part of like, so what does this mean? And what does this tell us about what the best path forward is going to be, and how can I benefit from that? So we're going to be doing a lot of things like that in the next couple of months, just having open forums and conversations. And so I would love it if people just showed up and joined that conversation with an open mind and an excitement about doing something positive, helping government serve you better. Absolutely. I don't know what else we can do.
Yeah, just get people to come and participate in the conversation.
Yeah.
One misconception I do want to clear up that I feel like I've heard is that once this decision is made, then everything changes immediately and people are going to have to reapply for their jobs, because that's a real fear, right? That there's going to be all of this change immediately. So can you talk us through what the timeline looks like?
That's not going to happen. It's not going to be like a light switch and just throwing all the pieces up in the air. So we are hashing that out. Like that's going to be part of the drafting, is to figure out like what would a logical timeline of implementation look like once we pick a plan. In I think sort of late October is what we're targeting to make a decision about which one of those top three choices do we think we should move forward with. We're going to like lay out all of that stuff. We have what we call 13 stipulations that we have to define, and it has to do with things like, you know, how contracts are going to be navigated and those kinds of things. But I think it's going to take at least several years before we are at like full implementation. It could be longer based on what we figure out as we design the plan, but it's definitely not going to be overnight. There's things that have to be in there, like students have to be able to complete at the school that they currently attend. There may be recommendations about how, choice and charter operate, because we know that's something that's really important to people. Yeah. Not charter probably, but choice, like sort of student assignment piece. So yeah, I mean, we are going to be extremely mindful. There's this phrase that's in our code that says we have to do things in, like, I think it's minimally disruptive. So figuring out how to phase in change. I think when we talk about like DSEG back in the 70s, like that was definitely not something that they were not phasing in change.
It was very abrupt.
It was just like, let's just throw kids to the wolves.
With no plan.
and
no
so
guardrails.
We see that, we all still feel that, and that is certainly not something that I intend to be proposing. So there will be an extended period of time for things to move as smoothly as possible.
So there's a phase-in structure, and we're thinking
that's
definitely
the
several
intent.
Years before.
For sure, 3 to 5 years is what we usually say. Is that then that's like from the time like something is passed in the legislature to say, yes, we agree this is the way to go. The governor has to sign that, and I think the intent is that probably 3 to 5 years would be like a quick timeline.
Okay,
because that's just the way things go in government, right?
Yep. We already said it. It moves at its snare pace.
But we are also talking about what are things that can happen immediately, and it would not be those kinds of like student assignment on the ground things necessarily. Are there things that we can propose streamlining of like back office operations for districts, things like that could happen much more quickly without shaking up people's daily lives?
That's good to know. And I think that speaks to a fear factor that's out there. So I think it's important for folks to know that once the decision is made and everything goes through legislation, hopefully this upcoming legislative season, there's still a whole process from getting from A to B with what that outcome is. So thank you so much for sharing that.
No problem. And we are wide open to that feedback, and we want to hear what people are worried about, but we also really want to hear what people's vision is for the future. So
we're excited. Let's get excited. I think we spend a lot of time in this space of being anxious and scared. Let's just get excited about what's possible and what happens when. First, these conversations have been happening for decades. So to actually get to the space of implementation and change for the city of Wilmington students, I think is humongous.
It is.
And it has such potential to make a big difference. And it's also the first step, right? There's so many different things that need to happen, but we have to at least have a space where the governing body is one entity for the city of Wilmington, so that we can then move forward from there.
It'll be so much easier for your voice to be heard when you have that streamlining, right? So and then the possibilities are endless. And from a policymaking perspective, that is the job. We're supposed to create space. We're supposed to create like a context for good things to happen for people in their daily lives. So, it's not about dictating. It's about making sure you have the best configuration so that educator voice can be raised, community voice can be raised, and make schools. I mean, that's how I've always seen our public schools. Your local school is yours. Yeah. It's not supposed to be something that is being, being done to you. It's supposed to be something that you are creating and participating in.
So you're kind of tilling the soil, right? If you use a garden metaphor, you're tilling the soil so that the flowers and the plants can be successful and strong.
And ultimately, it is up to students and families and educators to sow the seeds and reap the harvest.
I know, let's just keep going.
So like we can't do that for people. Yeah. We're just trying to make that as easy as possible for people to do. And that's why we need people to get excited about being a part of that, because none of this works if we don't have that empowered, enthusiastic participation of those using the system.
Agreed. Thank you so much.
Yay,
this was fun. So thank you so much, Senator Lockman, for coming in.
Lots to do.
And we are wrapping up, and that's it for Raising the Bar with Dr. O.